Hello everyone, Pastor George here with today's episode of A New Thing. Excited to be here. The title of this episode is gonna be very clickbaity. And if I got you, I got you. I'm glad I got you. Because we're gonna be talking about atheism today. But it's not going to be a full apologetic. Really what it's going to be is actually examining Ayaan Hirsi Ali's recent article, because I think it shows in an article, right? It's not like the most philosophical thing ever, but I think it reveals, or it should reveal to us, kind of the problems that we're facing in our secular age. And I don't mean that in the sense of like separation of government and religion, but rather I mean it in the sense that we tried since the 1800s really to replace religion with other social things, and I think her article does a good job of showing how that failed, and why she changed her mind. So before we get into that, though, I want to look at this episode. Golly, this article, this Bible passage here, Psalm 14, and believe it or not, don't pay attention to any of the ads you see on these things. Like, I'm not trying to buy grandma shirts, for instance. So, don't worry about any of that. That's just not what I'm interested in. All right, so Psalm 14. For the director of music of David. For the fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, their deeds are vile, there is no one who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on all mankind to see if there are any who understand, any who seek God. All have turned away, all have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. Do all these evildoers know nothing? They devour my people as though eating bread. Never call on the Lord, but there they are, overwhelmed with dread, for God is present in the company of the righteous. You evildoers frustrate the plans of the poor, but the Lord is their refuge. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores his people, let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad. Now, the reason I chose this, obviously, is because when people usually talk about atheism or think about atheism in relation to the Bible, because such a thing did not exist at the time that Scripture was around. I mean, my argument is, and I would not be alone in making this argument, many people would, is that atheism, as we currently understand it, the belief that there's no divine power out there at all, no God or gods or whatever, is very modern. I honestly think maybe you could trace it really to the 1600s at the earliest. I would really place it in the 1700s is when it becomes like a viable way of viewing things, and then it becomes more and more common, kind of starts with weirdo philosophers and gets down into the public and becomes more and more common up until today, where it's probably, I mean, at its height, in terms of people who identify that way. And so people, Christians especially, who will talk about this, usually use this verse, right? Psalm 14:1. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, their deeds are vile, and there is no one who does good. Now, of course, there's two clauses to that, right? So there's clause 1, which is the fool says in his heart, there is no God. And then there's clause 2, which is they are corrupt, their deeds are vile, there is no one who does good. Now, what the psalmist here is talking about in the first one, when we say fool, like in the Old Testament, when it says fool, when we think of fools in our context, we think stupid people. It's not saying you're stupid. That has nothing to do with it. In fact, the NIV here has a footnote that says the Hebrew words rendered fool in the Psalms denote one who is morally deficient. That's what it is, right? It's someone who acts as though there is no God, because again, at this time, there would not have been this understanding that there is no divine, right? Everyone believed in the gods, or God, in the case of the Hebrews, right? It was just, it would have been to do this, like just as an example of how people thought about this. We talked about early Christian persecution on Sunday at Christian Ed. And in Christian Ed, we talked, well, I didn't say this, I should have, because people probably would have found it interesting, but one of the charges that was commonly brought against Christians was for atheism, which obviously seems like a ridiculous charge. But in the ancient world, what that meant had nothing to do with lack of a belief in God, but living as though the gods did not exist. And that was important and a charge, because if you didn't sacrifice to the gods, and let's say an earthquake happened, then it was your fault that the earthquake happened, right? Poseidon was mad, and so he's punishing all of us because you refused to sacrifice to him. So they would be charged with atheism, right? So very common. And they weren't the first to do that. There were Greek philosophers before who were charged with that. Plato kind of famously was alluded to be an atheist, but was not. Like, he talks about God all the time in his writings, this just kind of divine being, right? He's not very specific about what it is, but he's not acting as though there's no divinity out there at all. That's pretty unheard of. And I mean, I've never heard of it. And I've really studied this stuff, but maybe if anyone knows anything, shoot me an email. So anyway, right? So the fool says in his heart, there is no God. And then he switches and he does talk about all of humanity, right? He says, they are corrupt, their deeds are vile, there is no one who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on all mankind to see if there are any who understand, any who seek God. All have turned away, all have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one, right? And this means everyone, all of us, right? This is not just some people, right? So one of the things that happens with atheists in particular is people stereotype them, especially Christians, as being evil, or more evil than other people. I mean, I don't think that's true. I certainly think atheism naturally, if one isn't guarded with their with our Christian moral order, easily leads someone into a belief that everything is relative, because I think that's actually the logical conclusion of atheism, right? Nothing matters, everything is relative, morality is made up, so let's just do whatever we want, right? I mean, I think that's fair. I mean, I think that plays itself out pretty well in a lot of the communist states that existed in the 20th century, and still exist now, with like China, for instance. But that's not a new thing. I mean, atheists themselves have said this since the 1800s, like Friedrich Nietzsche. So it's not like that's an original thought on my part. I think that reveals rather what humans are like without the constraints of the law, right? Without God's law constraining us, that's what we are like. And so that's why, the fool here is someone who is not morally upstanding because they don't follow the law. So it's people who reject God's law who say there is no God, and it has nothing to do with a belief. You could believe in the gods, or you could believe in the God of the Bible, but just reject His laws, and you are a fool, right? You're an atheist, effectively. And so why do I bring this up? Well, I bring this up because so often many of us probably have family or friends or whoever who are atheists. And so often you may write them off as a lost cause. And I really want to encourage you not to do that. I've had many friends who were atheists and are no longer. I have friends who still are. And I have friends who I believe are functionally atheists, but say they believe in God. And so, I have people all over the spectrum in my life, and we are called to minister to everyone, not just people who, who have beliefs that, won't offend us or won't say things that offend us or whatever, right? So you always have to minister to people. And the reason that this is important is because there is this article that just came out from Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who I'll talk about her in case you don't know her, but she wrote on Unheard, which is a British magazine, Why I Am Now a Christian. with the subtitle "Atheism Can't Equip Us for Civilizational War." Now, I read this article and I found it to be good. I will say that there are issues with it, which we're going to talk about. But the base issue in it, I think, is good. That she does get to the crux of the matter, which is, does a secular worldview offer things that are going to be beneficial for society in the long run? I mean, is it even consistent with itself is really the thing that she wants to bring up. Now, for those of you who don't know Ayaan Hirsi Ali, this is her. Let me just grab my mouse so make it easier. This is her up here. She is born in Somalia and moved around as a kid. I believe she was in Saudi Arabia for a little while, and then spent time in Kenya growing up, where she was influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood, which she's going to talk about in this. She grew up Muslim. Most Somalis are Muslim. It's a big issue kind of in East Africa. Our Kenyan congregants and other congregants from East Africa will probably understand that there is a kind of radical Muslim population in Somalia. One of the biggest groups is a group called Al-Shabaab. I was actually in Somalia. I wasn't in Somalia. I was in Kenya when in 2010 they bombed a prayer rally when I was there. So they were active. I don't know how active they are now, but they were pretty bad. So anyway, just to say that she grew up in a Muslim environment, and this is something she came to reject. You're going to see a little bit about this in the article, but she came to reject that as she left this area and moved to the West, and found out that in the West there's all sorts of differences and it's much better from her perspective and from my perspective. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend as though I disagree with her on that. I do think that the West as a place is definitely superior in many ways to the Middle East, and that has nothing to do with the color of people's skin or anything like that. It just has to do with the history and the values and the freedoms and things like that. Anywho, so this, I'm going to read the article and I'll comment on it as I go along to kind of flesh things out for you guys and really hit some points. So in 2002, I discovered a 1927 lecture by Bertrand Russell entitled "Why I Am Not a Christian." Bertrand Russell was a famous atheist in the early 20th century. He has lots of stuff to say. He's more of he's a mathematician, and a philosopher type guy. But I never really found his arguments all that good, and you'll see why going on. But she said, "It did not cross my mind as I read it that one day, nearly a century after he delivered it to the South London branch of the National Secular Society, I would be compelled to write an essay with precisely the opposite title." I should have said this before. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, part of her story is when she comes to the West, she identifies herself as an atheist and becomes, in the early 21st century, right, those 2000s and 2010s, a vocal supporter and member of this new atheist movement, which had started following 9/11 and is led by people like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, rest in peace, Dan Dennett, Sam Harris, other people like that. That's what I grew up hearing, which is why I'm so inoculated to a lot of these things. But it was a big deal when it started. It was really challenging, especially very popular among young people. And so this idea, right, that she's writing an article saying why I'm now a Christian is a big deal, because this is one of those big atheist figures from the early 21st century who's now become a Christian. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end. This isn't a time for gloating or whatever. This is a time for rejoicing, but definitely not definitely things that, to think about before we just declare someone a saint or whatever, right? All right. The year before, I had publicly condemned the terrorist attacks of the 19 men who had hijacked passenger jets and crashed them into the Twin Towers in New York. They had done it in the name of my religion, Islam. I was a Muslim then, although not a practicing one. If I truly condemned their actions, then where did that leave me? The underlying principle that justified the attacks was religious, after all. The idea of jihad, or holy war against the infidels. Was it possible for me, as for many members of the Muslim community, to simply distance myself from the action and its horrific results? At the time, there were many eminent leaders in the West, politicians, scholars, journalists, and other experts, who insisted that the terrorists were motivated by reasons other than the ones they and their leader, Osama bin Laden, had articulated so clearly. So Islam had an alibi. And for people who were around at the time, you remember this. I mean, I remember George W. Bush, I was a little kid, getting up and giving a speech in the wake of the September 11th attacks, where he said Islam means peace, right? I mean, actually, despite the kind of bad ways that many Americans acted towards Muslim Americans following September 11th, I will say that the general trend in the United States culture was to jump head over heels to try and not blame religion. Because I think the United States is a very pro-religion society, even though we have lots of problems with it maybe now, like in the sense of differences of opinion. But definitely in the 2000s, it was. And so, like, we didn't want to blame religious groups because even other religious groups at some core, understand that, if you start attacking one, you can kind of attack all of them in this way. And so they didn't want to do that. So I remember that. I don't know if any of you remember that either. And I actually agree with what she's about to say. She says, this excuse-making was not only condescending towards Muslims, it also gave many Westerners a chance to retreat into denial. Blaming the errors of U.S. foreign policy was easier than contemplating the possibility that we were confronted with a religious war. We have seen a similar tendency in the past 5 weeks as millions of people, sympathetic to the plight of Gazans, seek to rationalize the October 7th terrorist attacks as a justified response to the policies of the Israeli government. And I've seen that all over Twitter or X or whatever. I've even seen a friend do that because there is this, because we usually let our political ideals override our moral ones, and this goes across the spectrum. And so people will do that, right? They'll try and justify the reason that so many people were killed by Hamas as well, there's this and that or whatever, and I think you can believe that Israel is doing bad things, like not even in this war, but even before this war, way before it, without having to, obfuscate the idea that so many people were killed. But again, right, we have this idea, right, that we'll just say this is what we believe Islam is, even though most of us aren't Muslim, and it's not really historically correct, I think is important. But she continues. She says, when I read Russell's lecture, I found my cognitive dissonance easing. It was relief to adopt an attitude of skepticism towards religious doctrine, discard my faith in God, and declare that no such entity existed. Best of all, I could reject the existence of hell and the danger of everlasting punishment. So what she's saying is like, hey, I can get rid of all of this stuff I don't believe in, because she says, like, I'm basically non-practicing, just things like that. Didn't really like a lot about the religion, but realized that that atheism was an opportunity to shed herself from these kind of bonds and instead move on. And of course, also get rid of some of the poisonous things that she believed as well. Especially, it seems like she doesn't like the idea of hell, which, Christianity has that idea too. So it'd be interesting. But I do know that Muslims and Christians view hell slightly differently. So maybe it was the particular view of hell that Muslims had. I will say, just as a side note, no one tops the Buddhists. The Buddhists have the most insane view, not insane as in like they're dumb or whatever, but insane as in like over the top crazy type of thing, views of hell. Like hell, and like if Buddhism is right, chances are as Christians we're not going to end up in Buddhist hell. But whoa, if you do, it's brutal. All right, I bet most people don't know that, because most people don't think Buddhism is a hell because we're not taught correctly about it, because of flower power people from the 60s. Sorry, it's true. All right, keep moving. Russell's assertion that religion is based primarily on fear resonated with me. That is what Russell says, right? You're scared of hell, things like that. That's not. And I agree. That should not be your primary motivation. Although I do know people who have been. I don't want to say scared into it, but have seen that judgment and realized that they should believe in God because they don't want to face it. And I think that, that's all right. But I had lived for too long in terror of all the gruesome punishments that awaited me. While I had abandoned all the rational reasons for believing in God, that irrational fear of hellfire still lingered. Russell's conclusion thus came off as something of a relief when he said, "When I die, I shall rot." To understand why I became an atheist 20 years ago, you first need to understand the kind of Muslim I had been. I was a teenager when the Muslim Brotherhood penetrated my community in Nairobi, Kenya in 1985. Muslim Brotherhood is a political movement that seeks to make Islam the law of the land in the places where it's at. I don't think I had ever even understood religious practice before the coming of the Brotherhood. I had endured the rituals of ablutions, prayers, and fastings as tedious and pointless. The preachers of the Muslim Brotherhood changed this. They articulated a direction, the straight path, a purpose, to work towards admission into Allah's paradise after death. Allah is the Muslim word for God, or Arabic word for God. A method, the Prophet's instruction manual of do's and don'ts, the halal and haram. Yeah, halal is is allowed things, and haram is disallowed things. You probably see that on signs all around here where it says halal meat or whatever, because we have a decent Muslim population in the area. As a detailed supplement to the Quran, the Hadith spelled out how to put into practice the difference between right and wrong, good and evil, God and the devil. The Hadith, we talked about this in my course on Islam, but in case you don't remember, we're going to look at one today. Hadith are sayings of the Prophet Muhammad that aren't recorded in the Quran, because the Quran is technically, in Muslim theology, not Muhammad writing or saying stuff. It's God speaking through Muhammad. So hadith are what his life is like, because in Muslim jurisprudence you're supposed to live your life like Muhammad lived it. So that's the hadith. The Brotherhood preachers left nothing to the imagination. They gave us a choice. Strive to live by the Prophet's manual and reap the glorious rewards in the hereafter on this earth. Meanwhile, the greatest achievement possible was to die as a martyr for the sake of Allah. The alternative, indulging in the pleasures of the world, was to earn Allah's wrath and be condemned to eternal life in hellfire. Some of the worldly pleasures they were decrying included reading novels, listening to music, dancing, and going to the cinema, all of which I was ashamed to admit that I adored. Now, I should say that the average Muslim has no stipulation against doing any of these things, right? Especially here in the West, but I would say even in the Middle East as well. I mean, I haven't been there personally, but I've seen videos of Arabs dancing and things like that. It's worth noting that the Muslim Brotherhood is influenced by Wahhabism, which is a very extreme fundamentalist form of Islam. Now, I think there's a thread that goes throughout the whole religion, but it's worth noting that she was exposed to the fundamentalist part of it. The most striking quality of the Muslim Brotherhood was their ability to transform me and my fellow teenagers from passive believers into activists almost overnight. I guess I should talk to them if I want the youth group to do better. We didn't just say things or pray for things, we did things. As girls, we donned the burqa and swore off Western fashion and makeup. The boys cultivated their facial hair to the greatest extent possible. This is why the hadith is important, right? If you want to know why Muslim men tend to have beards, it's because Prophet Muhammad had a beard. And so they want to be like him and dress like him, right? So they wore the white dress like taub worn in Arab countries, or had their trousers shortened above their ankle bones. That's like Arab style, right? Because again, that's how Muhammad dressed. We operated in groups and volunteered our services and charity to the poor, the old, the disabled, and the weak, which is good, right? I mean, one of the things that's important in Islam is zakat, which is charity. And so you're supposed to do these types of things. It's how you earn merit in God's eyes. We urged fellow Muslims to pray and demanded that non-Muslims convert to Islam. During Islamic studies, we shared with the preacher in charge of the session our worries. For instance, what should we do about friends we loved and felt loyal to, but who refused to accept our dawah, invitation to the faith? Yeah, dawah is basically Muslim evangelism. That's the way that it's phrased there. And I mean, this is something that we deal with too as Christians, right? What do we do with people that we love and we invite to the faith, but they reject us? I think you see the difference here in what they're going to say. In response, we were reminded repeatedly about the clarity of the prophet's instructions. We were told in no uncertain terms that we could not be loyal to Allah and Muhammad while also maintaining friendships and loyalty towards the unbelievers. If they explicitly rejected our summons to Islam, we were to hate and curse them. Now again, do I think this is normal for most Muslims? No. Is this something that's relatively seen in the Prophet's life? I would argue yes. I do think Muhammad, again, I don't believe Muhammad's a prophet, but in the Prophet Muhammad's life, I think that this is kind of what he set them up to do. And this actually reminds me a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses, too. Jehovah's Witnesses do stuff like this. And Christians, we should absolutely not. You are supposed to be friends towards other people. Paul talks about this in his letters. Here, a special hatred was reserved for one subset of unbeliever, the Jew. We cursed the Jews multiple times a day and expressed horror, disgust, and anger at the litany of offenses he had allegedly committed. The Jew had betrayed our prophet. He had occupied the holy mosque in Jerusalem. He continued to spread corruption of the heart, mind, and soul. So this is very true. Like, I'm not just saying this as I'm not being Islamophobe or something. There is a special kind of distrust or dislike of Jews in Islam. And there's a historical reason for this, just to let you know. Just as an example of one of these things, this is from Sahih Muslims. This is a hadith. If you want to see what a hadith looks like, this is what it looks like. The hadith are sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. And so they're recorded and they're given a rating. Now, Sahih Muslim is one of the ones that's considered very authoritative. So that word Sahih, I can't remember what it means exactly, but it's the highest rating that a hadith can get. So, like, let's say the ones on the lower scale are rated lower, so you can be like, oh, the Prophet didn't say that. It's not very attested. The ones who are higher are the ones who are attested. And Sahih Muslim lived very close in time. He's interviewing people, and so his stuff is considered very authoritative. So, this is all about the end of days, right, that this is talking here. And so he quotes someone. He says, Abu Huraira reported Allah's messenger as saying, and Allah's messenger is the Prophet Muhammad, the last hour would not come unless the Muslims will fight against the Jews, and the Muslims would kill them until the Jews would hide themselves behind a stone or a tree, and a stone or a tree would say, Muslim, or the servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me. Come and kill him. But the tree Garkad would not say, for it is a tree of the Jews. And there's a lot of debate about, like, what that means, to be a tree of the Jews and things like that. I mean, by debate, I mean, I don't know. I'm not super familiar with Islamic jurisprudence. I'll just say, I don't understand what that means. And I couldn't really find a good answer online. So there is clearly from the Prophet, right, things that he did not like about Jews. And that's because there were Jewish Arabian tribes who fought against him when he was conquering the Arabian Peninsula. Also, a Jewish woman is the one who killed Muhammad by poisoning him. And so, like, there is quite a bit of, right, the Jew had betrayed our prophet. That's what she's mentioning here. As Westerners, we read this, we don't understand about anything that they're talking about. But, like, from what I've heard, if people who grow up in the Muslim world know exactly what they're talking about because this is drilled into you since you're a kid. And apparently there is some sort of prayer or something you say where you curse Jews in it. He had occupied the Holy Mosque in Jerusalem. And that is today what's going on, right, where Israel controls Jerusalem and there's a mosque there, which Muslims are still allowed to use, but, it's owned in all real instances by the Israelis, right? And so, of course, they continue to do things which make Muslims mad. So you can see why, to someone who had been through such religious schooling, atheism seemed so appealing. Bertrand Russell offered a simple zero-cost escape from the unbearable life of self-denial and harassment of other people. For him, there was no credible case for the existence of God. Religion, Russell argued, was rooted in fear. Fear is the basis of the whole thing. Fear of the mysterious, fear of defeat, fear of death. As an atheist, I thought I would lose that fear. I also found an entirely new circle of friends, as different from the preachers of the Muslim Brotherhood as one could imagine. The more time I spent with them, people such as Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, rest in peace, Christopher Hitchens, the more confident I felt that I had made the right choice. For the atheists were clever. They were also a great deal of fun. So, she points, and I think that like lots of atheists stereotype faith as being a fear of death. I've mentioned that in my sermons before. I think that's maybe true for some people, not true for me. I would like to say I believe in God because it's been revealed that it's true. I believe it's true, and the fact that death is defeated as a consequence of that is awesome, but not the main attraction to me. Zero cost escape, right, from an unbearable life of self-denial, right? Lots of religions teach you to deny yourself. That's because it's good to do that. Because believe it or not every instinct you have to give things to yourself is good. And maybe like it takes you out of yourself. But it's being able to view the commands of God in that way. Because obviously Christianity is big on self-denial, right? Take up your cross and follow me. Very important. And so being able to articulate that to your friends, right, and talk to people as it though, like, and living a life that's happy under the laws of God is important because it shows people that these restraints are actually not restraints. Like they're restraints that are positive, not negative ones. So then she goes, what changed? Why do I call myself a Christian now? She says, part of the answer is global. Western civilization is under threat from three different but related forces. The resurgence of great power authoritarianism and expansionism in the forms of the Chinese Communist Party and Vladimir Putin's Russia. The rise of global Islamism, which threatens to mobilize a vast population against the West. And the viral spread of woke ideology, which is eating into the moral fiber of the next generation. China and Russia are pretty brutal. Not great. I don't know too much about the rise of global Islamism. I think it's always kind of been there. I don't know how mobilizing it will get, but she would know. She's more plugged into those communities. And the viral speak of woke ideology. And again, I view woke ideology as being basically left-wing idealism or leftism. Not like liberal left-wing American things, but like farther left than that. And I definitely think that is playing a role in like how a lot of young people are getting their minds shaped, though I think a lot of people are also beginning to see through it. And I really think like every generation, the Zoomers will grow up and they'll see that maybe some of the good things that brought, but they're also going to see all the bad things and they're going to reject that. Because every generation rejects some of what the other generation before it held dear. And absolutely, I think that Zoomers are going to look at millennials like myself and be like, this stuff that you guys widely pushed is wrong, and we're going to reject it. I think that that's what's going to happen. But, I mean, this is a good reason. Like, Christianity does have an answer to these things, which she's going to talk about. She says, we endeavor to fend off these threats with modern secular tools, military, economic, diplomatic, and technological efforts to defeat, bribe, persuade, appease, or surveil. And yet, with every round of conflict, we find ourselves losing ground. We are either running out of money with our national debt in the tens of trillions of dollars, or we are losing our lead in the technological race with China. But we can't fight these formidable forces unless we can answer the question, what is it that unites us? The response that God is dead, from Friedrich Nietzsche, seems insufficient. So too does the attempt to find solace in the rules-based liberal international order. The only credible answer, I believe, lies in our desire to uphold the legacy of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, this is where this article is good, but also where I get a little worried, because I never think Christianity should be used as well, I don't really believe it, but it upholds my moral social order. It upholds like these ideals that I like, so we should support it anyway. Like, I don't think you should support something that you don't think is true. In the actual physical sense, there are lots of atheists who are like this, and it as a religious leader, it boggles my mind. But she is right in the sense that the things that we have answered that with, right, which is like kind of secularism, doesn't have an answer for a lot of the problems that the world is facing in terms of a philosophical and spiritual angle, right? Like, how do you argue with Muslims if, like, with the Muslim world, if you just insist that there's no God and they do, and you just say, well, religion doesn't really matter, all this other, well, to them it does. So how are you going to talk to them? And you can't just appeal to this rules-based, I like her word here, I don't know where she gets it from, but it's good, rules-based liberal international order, right, which is kind of what the West is. You saw this big time in the 90s and the 2000s, right? We're going to spread democracy. Democracy is good. It's inherently good. Why? We don't know. It just is, right? Because look how successful our countries are. That's why it's inherently good. And you can't do that, right? Because if people have no interest in that, if they don't think the value of life is found in stuff, they're not going to find that to be very, very persuasive. And obviously, it doesn't take a long time to realize that, oh, I can just break these rules and no one's going to punish me for it, which we see happen all the time. So she thinks that we should desire to uphold the legacy of the Judeo-Christian tradition. She says this legacy consists of an elaborate set of ideas and institutions designed to safeguard human life, freedom, and dignity. From the nation state and the rule of law to the institutions of science, health, and learning, as Tom Holland has shown in his marvelous book Dominion, all sorts of apparently secular freedoms of the market, of conscience, and of the press find their roots in Christianity. Yes, this is an awesome book. I was early adopter of this. I just want to say, you can go back in my stuff. I even wrote a newsletter recommending this book to you guys. So I'm a huge fan of Dominion, huge fan of Tom Holland. Best book of 2020. Deserves to go down as one of the best kind of history books, up there with like Guns, Germs, and Steel and other things that really kind of change the way that people feel. Even if there might be problems with it, okay? I'm not saying it's perfect or whatever. It's really good, though. And he does a good job in this age of showing that if you are an atheist, you're actually a Christian. You just don't believe in God. Simple as that. And it's absolutely true. 1,000%. And so I've come to realize that Russell and my atheist friends fail to see the wood for the trees. The wood is the civilization built on the Judeo-Christian tradition. It is the story of the West, warts and all. Russell's critique of those contradictions in Christian doctrine is serious, but it also too narrow in scope. For instance, he gave his lecture in a room full of former, or at least doubting, Christians in a Christian country. Think about how unique that was nearly a century ago, and how rare it is still in non-Western civilizations. Could a Muslim philosopher stand before any audience in a Muslim country, then or now, and deliver a lecture with the title, Why I Am Not a Muslim? In fact, a book with that title exists, written by an ex-Muslim, but the author published it in America under the pseudonym Ibn Warraq. It would have been too dangerous to do otherwise, because the punishment for apostasy in Islam is death, right? If you leave, that you're supposed to be killed, which is carried out in Muslim countries, not in the United States, obviously, not in Western Muslim societies, but like definitely in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia, that happens. To me, this freedom of conscience and speech is perhaps the greatest benefit of Western civilization. It does not come naturally to man. It is a product of centuries of debate within Jewish and Christian communities. This is probably my least favorite paragraph she has, even though it's not necessarily wrong. It was these debates that advanced science and reason, diminished cruelty, suppressed superstitions, and built institutions to order and protect life, while guaranteeing freedom to as many people as possible. I will say that, like, that this is a very Protestant reading of history, and as a Protestant, right, like, I'm willing to admit that. You'll see here, right, she says, unlike Islam, Christianity outgrew its dogmatic stage. I'd be interested to see, because I'm dogmatic, right, and dogmatic, just to let you know, it has dogma, right, it has to do with teachings. Like, I'm dogmatic in the sense that, like, I think it's important that we understand like that this is the truth and that these things are true and that we are confessional as a church, right? We have confessions. We should believe those confessions. They shouldn't just be, toilet paper for us, but we should take them seriously, right? We can seriously say that this is what makes us different than Baptists, and we're right. Now, it doesn't have to mean we're right, we're going to kill you. That's never how Christianity should operate, going back to Jesus, right? But technically, a lot of people will say, oh, the Middle Ages. And as someone who studied the Middle Ages, they're my main focus. That is not what the Middle Ages were like. There was a lot of freedom in the Middle Ages, more so than you think, even though there were definitely things that we look back on today would be shocked by. For the time, would actually be very forward-thinking. So I don't like that. I don't like this way of saying like that. It implies that religions have to go through a stage where they're dogmatic and then they're more enlightened. Like that's not what happens, right? Christianity it has always been enlightened. It became increasingly clear that Christ's teachings implied not only a circumscribed role for religion as something that separates from politics, it also implied compassion for the sinner and humility for the believer. Now, of course, I know many Christians who would, both on the right and the left, who would attack that, right? But I actually agree with her. I think that Christ is pretty clear that, yeah, absolutely. Should our beliefs affect life around us, right? Should we work for justice? And should that affect our politics? 1,000,000% yes. But like his role is not as a political person, definitely, right? He rejects that explicitly when he's with Pilate and when he's talking to his followers, right? He has not come to bring peace but a sword, but the sword he brings is not this sword of revolution or anti-colonialism or something, but instead a spiritual sword that's going to divide households as they have to grapple with the truth that he's revealing. It also implied compassion for the sinner and humility for the believer. I really do think this is true, and I think this is big in our Westminster Confessions, right? In Presbyterianism, we have this thing that says, and this is the best benefit of Protestantism by far as a movement, is it says God alone is Lord of the conscience. That's what we have in our confessions, right? And what that means is that you can believe something and we can think you're wrong, but we can ultimately not judge you eternally. That is God's role. And so if you really believe something because you believe that is what God is commanding you to do in Scripture, we can judge, certainly, right? Say, well, we disagree, you're not part of our fellowship, but we understand that we can be wrong. And this is important for Protestants, right? Because that's how our movement started. It started as a small movement trying to reform the church where most people told them they were wrong. And so we need to have compassion for people who are wrong, and we need to understand that we might be wrong, too. Yet I would not be truthful if I attributed my embrace of Christianity solely to the realization that atheism is too weak and divisive a doctrine to fortify us against our menacing foes. I have also turned to Christianity because I ultimately found life without any spiritual solace unendurable, indeed, very nearly self-destructive. Atheism failed to answer a simple question: what is the meaning and purpose of life? This from here is good. Russell and other activists, atheist activists, believe that with the rejection of God, we would enter an age of reason and intelligent humanism. But the God hole, the void left by the retreat of the church, has merely been filled by a jumble of irrational quasi-religious dogma. The result is a world where modern cults prey on the dislocated masses, offering them spurious reasons for being in action, mostly by engaging in virtue-signaling theater on behalf of a victimized minority or our supposedly doomed planet. The line, often attributed to G.K. Chesterton, has turned into a prophecy. When men choose not to believe in God, they do not thereafter believe in nothing. They then become capable of believing in anything. That's from G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy, I believe, which is a good book. And I do think that, like, she's talking about political movements here, right? And I think you could do this with all... She seems to be mostly attacking, it seems, left-wing political movements, but I think you can easily do this with right-wing political movements as well. So many people identify themselves primarily by their politics these days, and that's exactly what the people want you to do. And I don't disagree with her on these things, right? Like, these political movements have a religious zealotry to them, because it gives meaning to your life, right? I also think of like people like Andrew Tate, who give meaning to a lot of young guys in very similar ways, right? And it's not good. And you know, you can claim belief in God and also do these other things, but I think where you're putting your energy and your heart reveals where God is for you. And I agree with G.K. Chesterton, right? You find something else to fill that, and you could believe in all sorts of stuff, right? Should not surprise us that things like Soviet communism and Nazism took the place of Christianity in Europe. In this nihilistic vacuum, the challenge before us becomes civilizational. This is very 90s, isn't it? It's a Clash of Civilizations by Francis Fukuyama type stuff. Actually, no, it's not. That's the end of history. It is the guy before him. We can't withstand China, Russia, and Iran if we can't explain to our populations why it matters that we do. We can't fight woke ideology if we can't defend the civilization that is determined to destroy, that it is determined to destroy. And we can't encounter Islamism with purely secular tools. To win the hearts and minds of Muslims here in the West, we have to offer them something more than videos on TikTok. The lesson I learned from my years with the Muslim Brotherhood was the power of a unifying story embedded in the foundational texts of Islam to attract, engage, and mobilize the Muslim masses. Unless we offer something as meaningful, I fear the erosion of our civilization will continue. And fortunately, there is no need to look for some new age concoction of medication and mindfulness. Christianity has it all. That's why I no longer consider myself a Muslim apostate, but a lapsed atheist. Of course, I still have a great deal to learn about Christianity. I discover a little more at church each Sunday, but I have recognized in my own long journey through a wilderness of fear and self-doubt that there is a better way to manage the challenges of existence than either Islam or unbelief had to offer. So that's the article, and I know that I've been going for almost 50 minutes at this point, so I'm just going to sum up at the end here quickly. I appreciate what she said. As you can see, I had a lot to say about it, and I think that there's a lot of good there, and I think it does a good job of exposing the weakness of the atheist worldview to many of our friends and our families, where, you know, I don't really let people get away with it. I mean, I've made some friends mad about this before, but I don't let you get away with saying that, if you're an atheist, with saying that things are wrong, because I'm always like, wrong based on what? You know, why is polygamy wrong? Because you were told since you were a kid that it's wrong because no one does it in our society? Like, no, that's not a good reason, right? You can't say to a Muslim, for instance, who practices polygamy, that's wrong, if you can't articulate why in a compelling way that just doesn't rely on your own worldview versus their own worldview. Except theirs, actually, I would say, is a little bit more consistent, because at least they're basing their morality on something outside of themselves and outside on something that's infallible. Like, we could say it's fallible, but, you know, in our view, right, these things aren't fallible. It's at least a basis to work off of, rather than just the whims of people. And so that's the problem that she points out here, right? Is that if we're going to contend with these things, if we're going to understand these things, we have to understand them as people do, and we have to understand that our solutions to these things aren't working, because we've ripped the rug out under ourselves of all of the civilizational pillars that supported this, right? Why is democracy good? Just because we said so. You know, why is freedom of religion good? Because, you know, we've said so. It's just been that way. Why, you know, and we should be inquisitive. I think one of the best things the New Atheist taught me is don't accept things just because people tell you that these things are true, right? Question, interrogate. And I absolutely agree with that. The problem is many people in the West, functional atheists and not, maybe only go so far with that, with things that they dislike or things that they think are going to limit their personal enjoyment of life. But they never do it to themselves. And that is really what Ayaan Hirsi Ali thing is getting at. So I appreciate what she said. I hope she sticks with it. You know, even she's tentative about her own thing. But I think that I hope and pray that the Lord works on her heart to bring her to a fuller understanding and view Christianity not just as a political tool, especially not at that, but as, something that changes your heart so much, so that you will then, in fact, act out of those things, not for political reasons, but for spiritual ones. All right, so 50 minutes. Wow, good one. I'm really putting in overtime this week. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. I will see you on Sunday for worship. Peace out.